Hello, welcome back. Okay, so now we're going to finish book 3 of the Nicomachean Ethics. There's only a little bit left, and this is on the virtue of temperance. Now, temperance is a mean with respect to pleasures, and licentiousness is the vice of excess. There is going to be a vice of deficiency. He's already mentioned it very briefly before, but in this last part of book 3, he's going to concentrate on the virtue, temperance, and on the vice of excess, licentiousness, and he'll explain why he doesn't say that much for the vice of deficiency a little bit later on. So he starts the same way that he did with courage. Remember, for Aristotle, these virtues have very specific spheres of action. They're quite narrow. They're about very specific things. So like he did with courage, he's going to explain what the virtue of temperance is about. So it has to do with pleasures. So first of all, he draws a distinction between pleasures of the soul and pleasures of the body. Temperance has nothing to do with pleasures of the soul. Pleasures of the soul could be things like the love of civic advancement. Remember here, he's writing within the Athenian community, within the idea of the best kind of thing you could be is the citizen of Athens who's part of the running of the state. So that's why his first example is this love of civic advancement, of being part of your community and being the Athenian citizen. Or the love of learning, that's another example of a pleasure of the soul. But neither of these is temperance. It is possible to go wrong in this particular sphere, in the sphere of the pleasures of the soul. For example, you could be a lover of idle gossip or idle talk, but this kind of thing is not licentiousness. It's not the vice associated with temperance because it's in a different sphere of activity. Okay. Pleasures of the body is what licentiousness is about, but even here, not all of them. Not the enjoyment of objects of sight through the sense of seeing or hearing or smelling. Only those that are related to the objects of the objects of temperance. So enjoying the smell of a rose is not related to temperance at all, and it's something that has nothing to do with this virtue. But enjoying the smell of a dish is related to temperance and licentiousness because it's related to the pleasure of eating the dish. So it's a roundabout way of being connected to the pleasure. Only when the smell has to do with the underlying pleasure of eating is it related to this particular virtue. And he notices that animals can feel these kinds of pleasures as well. For example, when a lion feels pleasure at the sight of a gazelle, it's because he's thinking of the meal he's going to have. So this is not an aesthetic pleasure at the beauty of the gazelle. That would be a pleasure of the soul. The lion is not capable of that. But because the sight of the gazelle gives the lion pleasure, because he's going to be eating the gazelle, that's part of this kind of pleasure that's relevant to temperance and licentiousness. Okay, so these kinds of pleasures, mainly of taste, but also of touch, of sight, when they're related to the taste, are shared between humans and animals. And the licentious man indulges in these pleasures of taste to an extreme. This is a vice of too much. He wants too many of them, he wants them too often, he wants to prolong them. And Aristotle gives here the example of a man, a gourmet, who wished that his throat could be elongated so that he could feel the pleasure of his food for so much longer, so that he could be experiencing the taste of this lovely food for a much longer time, as an example of what the licentious wants. He wants this experience to go on for much longer. And the greatest the scope for licentiousness is found in hunger, and that is what's shared with animals. That's why the licentious is a brutish, animalistic kind of person, because he wants to overindulge in this basic pleasure that animals can also feel. Touch is another pleasure which is related to licentiousness, and its object can be refined as, for example, the pleasure you'd get from a massage, but the licentious man concentrates on the wrong kind of place for touch. Aristotle doesn't say this here, but presumably he means overindulging in touching the kinds of parts of the body that give sexual pleasure. So the licentious man has the wrong object for the pleasure of touch. And then he gives quite a few examples of how you can go wrong by going too much and the wrong object. He's already told us that this is what vice is. Virtue can only be found in one particular point, but you can go wrong in many ways, and these many ways can be the wrong object of pleasure, too much pleasure, in the wrong kind of way, and so on. Okay, then he talks a little bit about desire, the desires associated with these pleasures. He says that certain desires, for example, for food or for sex, are natural. They have a natural element in them. Although it can express itself differently in many different people. So different people can have a desire for different kinds of foods or for sex in different sorts of ways, for example, presumably. And with natural desires, we're not wrong in actually fulfilling them. We're wrong in indulging them to excess. It is when we exceed what is required by nature that we go wrong. With other kinds of pleasures, people go wrong in many different ways. They can enjoy the wrong things in the wrong ways or more than what is normal. And all of this is licentiousness, indulging natural pleasures too much or indulging other kinds of pleasures in the wrong way or to an excess or at a wrong time or with the wrong person. Now also another part of pleasure is pain, but the pain here is different. Licentiousness is not like the vice of cowardice. In cowardice, you had a problem that the pain was felt too much and it was overwhelming. And in a sense, the courageous person was the one who was able to endure the pain and do the right thing despite the fear and the pain that he was feeling at the time. But there is no analogy here, direct analogy with temperance. Temperance is not about feeling pain and being able to endure it. The temperate man doesn't feel pain at the absence of pleasurable things because he no longer sees them as pleasurable. The temperate man is the one who correctly judges when pleasurable things ought to be pleasurable and fulfills that desire, but then he doesn't have that desire to an excess. Other pleasurable things simply do not appear pleasurable to him because he is virtuous. This is a really important point that we'll come to understand later on when we look at book 7 and we talk about weakness of will. So hold that thought that for Aristotle, the virtuous is not struggling against contrary desires. The virtuous does not see these things as desirable because he sees them in light of the noble and the good. Okay. The licentious man makes exactly this mistake. He sees things that are undesirable as desirable. That's why the doctrine of the mean is a doctrine of appropriateness. The licentious fails to see what is appropriate and he's attracted to things that he ought not to be attracted to. Okay, then Aristotle talks a little bit about the vice of deficiency, and he does say that here the vice of deficiency is very, very rare. Because there is a natural element to these desires, it's rare to find someone who errs with respect to deficiency, who doesn't feel these pleasures at all, because that would mean that they have no natural inclinations towards these pleasures. And he says there is no name for this, even though earlier on when he was listing all the virtues, he did say that perhaps that person could be called insensible. Okay, back to the temperate, and then he explains to us why the temperate follows the doctrine of the mean. These are things that we've heard before, so there's nothing surprising here. We know therefore that the temperate is not going to enjoy the wrong pleasures. They're simply not going to be enjoyable for him. He's not going to be distressed by the absence of pleasures because these are not pleasures for him. And he's not going to enjoy without qualification. So everything he does will go through the filter of the right principle. He is moderate with respect to pleasures that are related to bodily health because he fulfills them only to the extent to which his body needs them and no further than that. And he appreciates all the pleasures correctly. Okay, he's nearly finished. And he finishes with making a very interesting point about choice. Remember, the chapter started with the importance of choice and the voluntary. And he makes a point here. I'm not too sure we would now, with modern knowledge of psychology agree with him, but this is what Aristotle says. Remember, in this set of series, we're not really criticizing the work so much as trying to just understand the basics of what Aristotle says. So what does he say? He says that licentiousness, the vice of excess, is more like the voluntary, because he thinks there is more of an element of choice in choosing to pursue pleasure. That's not like cowardice. Cowardice has less of an element of choice because it is caused by pain. And for Aristotle, pain is more difficult to endure because it must be avoided. And the experience of pain can distract the sufferer. Now, as I said, you may not agree with the psychology behind all this. You may not think that pain has these characteristics, whereas pleasure has completely different ones. But this is what Aristotle says. So Aristotle thinks that licentiousness has more of a voluntary element, that people choose to indulge in pleasure, whereas people are overwhelmed by pain and fear. And that makes licentiousness more reprehensible. This is the important bit. Where there is more choice, there is more moral responsibility for making the wrong choice. Therefore, you're more reprehensible for being licentious than for being a coward. And Aristotle also claims that it is easier to habituate yourself away from pleasures because there is no danger when you avoid them. Whereas cowardice has more of a compulsive element because the fear takes over and causes you to run away, for example, to behave like a coward. Quite a lot of psychological assumptions here that perhaps we don't agree with. But I think the important point here is that Aristotle is trying to create a moral theory that's psychologically informed. And this has advised a lot of the ways in which modern contemporary virtue ethicists have approached the question, how should I live my life? That the answer to this kind of question ought to be psychologically informed, and there should be connections between psychology and morality. Okay, final point in this bit, a final point about children. Children, he says, are licentious by nature. This is what it means to be a child because they lack restraint. And the lack of restraint is part of childhood and is included in the need to educate them to learn to control their desires. We have to recognize that children are naturally licentious. One of the things they have to do is to learn slowly to cultivate their desires through a long process, which does involve things like habituation, for example, instruction and practice, how to control these desires. Irrational beings are indiscriminate and insatiable in their appetites, and it is reason that comes to control these types of desires. In the temperate, we have an example of someone whose reason has come to control their desires completely. So their desires are expressed at the right time, towards the right object, with the right sort of way, towards the right sort of person. There is harmony here between reason and desire, and it's all controlled by the recognition of the right principle. Remember back the definition of virtue: purposive disposition lying in a mean, determined by the right principle. So it is reason that is going to determine what is and isn't a right desire at the right time, with the wrong person, in the right way, and everything else that goes into it. More on this on book 7, which is a really important and an extremely complicated book, and the Nicomachean ethics of weakness of will. But anyway, next time we move on to book 4 and some more virtues. Some of the most interesting and difficult virtues in Aristotle because they don't have contemporary equivalents, and they give rise to some of the objections against Aristotelian theory. So we'll be looking at virtues like magnificence and magnanimity. So come to the next video to find out what these are.